Welcome back to World History. When we last left our heroes, the French had just torn down the basic structure of their government and society in the first phase of the French Revolution. So today we're going to look at the things that they built up in order to replace that in what we're going to call the good revolution, quote unquote. So by the end of today's lesson, you should be able to describe the goals of the French revolutionaries as articulated in the Declaration of the Rights of Man. You should be able to evaluate the issues that divided the National Assembly and created some of the problems we're going to talk about. And you should identify the events that led to the end of the monarchy in France, the downfall of the Bourbons. So, without further ado, let's get started. With all of French society having been torn down over the span of a night, the French revolutionaries in the National Assembly tried to replace it with a document called the Declaration of the Rights of Man, which laid out their basic philosophy for society. And we see a lot of really great pieces in here. For example, men are free, born free and equal in rights. These rights involve life, liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression. And it protects all of the rights that we love in the United States today. For example, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, equal protection under the law, stuff like that. So as we go forward, keep in mind that these are the principles that the French Revolution was established upon, and we're going to talk about how well they protected these principles going forward. The problem the National Assembly faced is, yes, they all agreed that men are born equal in rights, but who should enjoy those rights is an immediate source of contention between the different groups of people. For example, what about poor people who don't have much property or don't own much? Should they have an equal say in the government to wealthy people? This was one of the first things that divided the National Assembly, as they argued that there should be a difference between what they called active citizens, who have property and therefore have a vested interest in protecting society, and passive citizens who did not have enough property and therefore didn't have a right to vote. The National Assembly agreed that only people who own property should be active citizens, and therefore the vast majority of French people did not have the right to vote, so only about 4 million out of a population of 28 million actually had the right to vote for members of the National Assembly. Other Frenchmen argued that wasn't fair. All people should be able to vote in what's called universal suffrage, and so this was one of the key divides. The other divide was going to be the role of the king, because everyone agreed that there needed to be someone sort of in charge on top. And so with the king playing the role of chief executive, the question was, to what degree could he control the actions of the National Assembly? Could he stop laws from being passed? Could he delay laws from being passed? Or is he just some sort of figurehead out there who represents the French people but doesn't have any actual power? So the new National Assembly was debating all of these issues and trying to figure out exactly where they stood and what their new government should look like based on the principles of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen. And it's in this situation where the entire sort of French government is debating these things that a major crisis emerged which threw everything into chaos. This is the Women's March on Versailles, and you're going to read a document that goes into more detail on this. But the very simplest explanation is there was a shortage of bread, which led to higher food prices, which led the women of Paris to decide that it was time for them to march from Paris over to Versailles and tell the National Assembly to stop arguing about who should get the right to vote and get us some food because we're relatively hungry here. So you get a mob of women who armed themselves and started marching to go confront the government. The head of the National Guard, a guy named the Marquis de Lafayette, tried to stop them, but in the end, his army and his soldiers turned on him and joined the mob of women. And so a combination of these women and National Guardsmen confronts the king at Versailles. And there's this incredibly tense confrontation where it looks like the royal family is going to be torn to bits by a group of angry women. But Lafayette here's Lafayette, is able to broker a compromise in which the king is going to agree to come back to Paris with the women and try to address some of their concerns. And so here we see the king backing down. And the king and the entire National Assembly is now going to move from their isolation at the Palace of Versailles back to the city of Paris in order to theoretically be more accountable to the people. One effect that the Women's March on Paris and the King and the National Assembly's return to Versailles is going to have is it's going to freak out a lot of the nobles. The nobles are going to see this angry mob of women and the soldiers joining them and start thinking like, we might not be safe in Paris. And so what's going to happen is a group of nobles called the émigrés. These wealthy nobles are going to flee the country. This is going to include the king's two brothers, who are both also going to flee the country. And so this is going to create a lot of tension and pressure within the revolution. The next effect that the move back to Paris is going to have is it's going to lead to the different groups within the revolution developing into factions. So the people who are more conservative and still want to have a monarchy are going to start meeting and sitting together on the right side of their new assembly hall, whereas the people who want to abolish the monarchy and want to move the revolution forward are going to be sitting on the left side of the assembly hall. And so this is going to lead to more of these people simply talking to each other, which makes them more convinced of their correctness and is going to lead to increasing radicalization from both sides. In addition to all this, we're going to get the rise of an even more radical faction known as the Jacobins. The Jacobins are going to be probably the most radical faction at this point, meaning they want the most change. They start talking about things like potentially overthrowing the monarchy, providing universal suffrage, redistributing property, some of these things that are way outside of the mainstream. And so some of your leading Jacobins are going to be a guy named Maximilien Robespierre here. He's going to be very important to our story going forward. Also, Georges Danton and Jean-Paul Marat. These radical leaders are really going to start pushing the revolution forward, and they're going to become some of our leading figures as our story develops. So the move back to Paris leads to increasing radicalization and the arrival of new factions. The Jacobins weren't even a member of the National Assembly, but they were groups of citizens in Paris who now, because the assembly was there, were able to exert more power. It's under this situation, with increasing radicalization and increasing pressure on the king and the monarchy, that the king decides that he might not be safe in Paris. The flight to Varennes is an attempt by the royal family to flee the country. They sneak into a carriage using disguises, and they try to slip out of France, hopefully going to Austria, where the royal family is no longer at risk of angry mobs of armed women coming and forcing them to do things. Unfortunately for the king, he's recognized because of his very large nose, which was printed on all of the country's currency. And so by looking at the king's basically image on the currency, someone is able to recognize the king and the family are recaptured, and they are brought back to Paris. The effect of this is, of course, people stop trusting the king. Which, of course, a lot of people had already stopped trusting Louis, but now even people who had previous supporters of him stopped trusting him, and any sort of illusion that the king had come to Paris on his own accord was totally shattered, and it was very clear now to everyone that the king was a prisoner within Paris. The tensions over what to do with the king finally boiled over on the 2nd anniversary of the storming of the Bastille. There's a confrontation between very radical Parisians from a very poor district of Paris and the National Guard. These radical Parisians want the king put on trial and punished for his attempt to escape, whereas the government is not totally comfortable with that, nor is the army. So there's this massive showdown in this public area of Paris known as the Champ de Mars, and the National Assembly starts firing on the crowd. A bunch of people are killed, and it further increases tensions between the radicals of Paris, who want lots of change to happen right now, and the National Guard and the National Assembly, who's now seen as insufficiently radical and not pushing for enough change. So we're seeing, again, increasing tensions within the government in Paris. So we're going to end our story today with the establishment of this constitutional monarchy. At this point, France comes up with a new constitution in which the power of the king is limited, but only a small fraction of people in France get the vote. And so we're going to start seeing this battle between the more conservative groups of people who want to keep the constitutional monarchy in place, and a group called the Mountain, this radical group of Jacobins who is now trying to seize power and potentially overthrow the French government. And so at the moment, the king is still the king, the National Assembly is still the National Assembly, and everything is somewhat settled. But obviously there's these huge groups of people in Paris who are unhappy with the way things are going, and they're just waiting for an opportunity to rise up, to overthrow all these people, and to establish what they see as a more fair system of government. So this brings us back to our central questions. We're going to hopefully talk about comparing the goals of the Declarations of the Rights of Man to the issues that divided the National Assembly, and then explain the events, mostly the king trying to run away, that led to the Bourbon dynasty falling from power, and then all the stuff that's going to happen next week as the French Revolution gets truly crazy.